By late November of 1966, the investigation into the Sims family murder had moved to the east coast of Florida. Sheriff Joyce announced that he was sending 20 of his deputies to Brevard County. For anyone not familiar, Brevard County is on the east coast of Florida, just east of Orlando, and encompasses towns like Cocoa Beach, Cape Canaveral, Titusville, and Palm Bay. On November 30th, 1966, the Brevard County Sheriff's Office announced that they had someone in custody for questioning in the Sims murder case. Reports indicate the man was a former mental patient. Please remember that detail. You see, the lead from Brevard County came from an accidentally crossed telephone line. A woman trying to place a call on a party line overheard a man tell his mother that he had, quote, done a horrible thing. I have killed 3 people.
It's mostly quiet on Muriel Court, but that wasn't the case in 1966 when Robert Sims, his wife Helen, and young daughter Joy found gagged, stabbed, and shot to death.
Safer politically to leave it alone.
Get in there and take care of the problem.
Moronic is the word that comes to mind.
He's accusing 2 top officials of a cover-up.
Standing back there under the banana tree.
Surveillance video of a 1966 FSU football game may be the key to cracking the code in this case gone cold.
You do that.
And while state officials aren't releasing details regarding suspects or persons of interest, they did stress their commitment to finding the Sims killers.
Oh, I think you did it. All of a sudden you became absolutely down, totally obsessed with that.
It's a case that we would certainly like to see solved, and investigators are actively working on the case.
Now, as I just mentioned, a woman trying to place a call on a party line overheard a man tell his mother that he had done a horrible thing. I have killed 3 people. Remember this and the way it was said. It will come into play later. The caller then threatened to kill himself. The conversation allegedly included enough to make authorities believe it was in connection with the Sims murder. According to an article in the Evening Tribune from Cocoa Beach, the name Sims was used during the conversation. The woman who overheard the conversation even took a lie detector test and passed. The police, along with the telephone company, was able to narrow down the call to a block of 200 telephones in central Brevard County. But the investigation in Brevard fizzled out, and there were rumors of headbutting between Leon County Sheriff William Joyce and Brevard County Sheriff Lee Wilson. We have other matters to tend to, Wilson told the Orlando Sentinel, including the search for the North Brevard bomber. So, with the lead from Brevard County no longer going anywhere, where do authorities look next? Around the same time that the investigators were running down the lead in Brevard County, dozens of the Sims neighbors, friends, and acquaintances had taken polygraphs. Some of them had been asked to take the test in order to check on whether information had been missed in previous informal questioning, and some volunteered because they just wanted to clear their name. Among these people, the sheriff said, were a young boy and girl who lived in the neighborhood and had been the subject of widespread rumors. Remember this detail. At the time, the sheriff refused to release any of the names of those who had been polygraphed. So now we're in late November 1966, and over a month since the murders. The Florida Sheriff's Bureau technicians were still working on identifying hundreds of fingerprints taken from the house and properties of the Sims family. These include many left by guests of the family over a period of months and all the police and gawkers that showed up to the crime scene. There was no AFIS back then, so the only way to eliminate fingerprints was to have each possible person come down and be printed for comparison. Sheriff Joyce told the Tallahassee Democrat around this time that every activity and association of the Sims family during their residence in Tallahassee, and there wasn't a single piece of evidence of ill will or past disagreement that might have provided a motive for the triple slaying. Or was there? An early suspect was Dr. C.A. Roberts. The C.A. stood for Cecil Albert. He was the pastor of the First Baptist Church, one of the city's oldest and most prestigious churches. Roberts was from Waco, Texas. He went to school at Baylor University, a private Christian university in Waco, where he got his bachelor's degree. He then went on to get his Ph.D. at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth, Texas. Not long after arriving in Tallahassee, he won the Tallahassee Junior Chamber of Commerce Man of the Year in 1963. The following year, Roberts won the Florida Man of the Year. He was articulate. He was everything a congregation would want in their preacher, Reverend Douglas Dortch told the Ocala Star-Banner in 2011. Pastor Roberts was described as having a kind of cult following. People would come to morning mass to watch him preach, and then come back in the afternoon to watch again, just to hear him speak. He was one of the keynote speakers at many events from Florida to Texas. You see, Helen Sims was the secretary at this church, and her family was deeply involved with the church. But as I mentioned, she had just resigned from her position just days before the murder. Tallahassee may be a big city now, but back then, as I've mentioned before, it was more of a small town, and you know how small towns are. C.A. Roberts had a reputation of being quite the ladies' man. As a matter of fact, during the investigation, it was discovered that he was having affairs with many women in town. When Roberts was named a suspect in the case, several women actually called up Larry Campbell. Remember the 24-year-old lead investigator on the case? They were calling Campbell to say that they didn't do it. They didn't commit the crime. Just because they were having an affair with the pastor, they didn't kill the Sims family. Roberts was even rumored to be having an affair with Helen Sims. The pastor's roving eye and the timing of Mrs. Sims' resignation seemed suspect. When Pastor Roberts had the audacity to call Mrs. Sims by her first name while officiating at her memorial service, the rumor mill began to churn even more. Back in those days, you didn't call a woman by her first name, apparently. But an affair seemed highly unlikely. There was a lot of speculation that she disapproved of Roberts' philandering ways. It was more probable that Pastor Roberts made a pass at Helen, and it made her just uncomfortable enough to quit. Maybe she rejected his advances, leading him to murder her in fear of being found out as a philanderer. Now, funny side note, Dr. Roberts once gave a sermon titled The Ethics of Sex. I have a clip of that I'll play for you now.
We had announced last Sunday that this morning I was going to preach on the subject, the ethics of sex. Now this is supposed to be a sophisticated sermon because sex in our day is a very sophisticated subject. Miss Green in her book, Sex on the College Campus, says that today the name of the game that is being played across our country in relation to sex is cool. And that the new ethic is there is no morality. When you speak of sex, you can speak of it as wise or unwise, healthy or unhealthy, glorious or wasteful, but never moral or immoral. Or morality has nothing to do with it. Well, I want you to know that this isn't going to be a sophisticated sermon. Because in the first place, I don't feel in a sophisticated mood, although I must admit that the temptation is very strong to want to appear sophisticated in the eyes of others. I want you to know that in the few minutes that are allotted to me, although I realize there's pitifully poor, small amount that can be accomplished in what we have here, I want you to know that this morning the one thing I desire to say above all else is that sex is moral.
Investigators probed deeply into Robert's comings and goings and into his interactions with parishioners. Furthermore, investigators were unable to unearth any evidence of an affair between the pastor and Mrs. Sims. By all accounts, Dr. and Mrs. Sims were very much in love and said to be inseparable. And in the end, Pastor Roberts had a seemingly solid alibi. He was the FSU team chaplain and was seen there in the game's film footage pretty much the whole time the game was going on, except during halftime. Now, there are some reports that Roberts left the field at halftime and other reports that he left and came back for the second half of the game wearing different clothing. You can't tell on the videotape, as he's seen wearing a black suit before and after halftime. But was it the same black suit? Surely a pastor owns more than one black suit. Investigators actually tried every route in every traffic condition to see if Roberts could have left at the beginning of halftime, committed the murders, and returned by the beginning of the third quarter. They said it was impossible. But unfortunately, in light of the accusations, Roberts had to step down as pastor. Many in the town continue to believe that he was the killer, and some continue to believe it to this day. There's no doubt in my mind that C.A. had nothing whatsoever to do with the murders. He was just a victim of circumstance and his own foibles, Leon County Sheriff Larry Campbell told the Tallahassee Democrat in 2011. C.A. Roberts was killed a few years later in a traffic accident. So C.A. Roberts had a solid alibi. There's no way he could have murdered the Sims family. But come down this rabbit hole with me real quick. Roberts was said to have a cult-like following. People adored him, worshipped him even. Could he have gotten one of his followers to do his dirty work for him? Maybe Helen Sims, being Pastor Roberts' secretary, had a front row seat to all of Roberts' affairs, which many are rumored to have happened in his office. Maybe Helen Sims knew too much. Now that she had quit her job, maybe Roberts was afraid she would talk. She had to be silenced so Dr. C.A. Roberts could keep his reputation as the Golden Boy. This scenario is possible, I think. Now, there's another scenario that involves 3 men, and to this we don't know who they are, where they came from, or even if they ever really existed. But a source of mine, who will be revealed later in this series, has a theory that Mr. and Mrs. Sims had planned on outing Pastor Roberts for his dirty deeds to the church congregation that Sunday, which would have been the day after the murders. In order to keep his reputation intact, the killers were sent by C.A. Roberts to convince the Sims to keep quiet about his sexual activities. Roberts did not intend for the murders to happen, but the 3 men who went to the Sims' house did not understand what the preacher wanted. But let's backpedal here for a second and talk about the crime scene. All 3 victims were bound with items from their own home, hosiery and such. Dr. Robert Sims had been shot once at point-blank range in the head. Helen Sims had been shot 3 times, twice in the head and once in the leg. But 12-year-old Joy had been shot in the head, stabbed 6 or 7 times in the torso with a large hunting knife, a butcher knife, or possibly a bayonet. Her underwear was pulled down and her nightgown was pulled up, suggesting a possible sexual assault. She appeared to have been beaten about the face and the head, and there were bruises on her inner thighs. If this was some kind of hit made by Pastor Roberts, or anyone else for that matter, why was Joy, 12-year-old Joy, killed in such a brutal fashion? Dr. and Mrs. Sims were taken out rather quickly, but Joy was overkilled. Why? And was Joy the actual target? So, before the break, I left you with a question. Was Joy the main target of this killing? Before we explore this, we need to get a couple more suspects out of the way. Robert Howells of Tallahassee was by all accounts a drunk and a very violent man. Howells married a woman named Peggy in December of 1966. The day after their wedding, as they drove to Alligator Point where they planned to honeymoon, Howells told Peggy in detail how he killed the Sims family. Why? He said he had gotten into an altercation with Helen Sims at the grocery store a few days prior to the murders. He had followed her home and planned to come back later and kill her. Peggy kept quiet about this until sometime in the 80s when she wrote a letter to police telling them what her then ex-husband had confessed to her. She also claimed he still had the gun that was used in the murder. Peggy and Robert Howells had a tumultuous relationship. He frequently beat her and threatened to kill her and her children, just like he killed the Sims. It appears as if those years Peggy was too scared of Howells to come forward, but then finally she did agree to help police by wearing a wire, letting her house be bugged by investigators, and trying to get him to confess again to the murders. Unfortunately, Robert Howells was tipped off by one of his daughters, and they never got the confession. Howells eventually dropped off the suspect list because his motive was weak and there was really no evidence whatsoever that he had anything to do with the murders. His fingerprints didn't match any found at the crime scene, and he passed a polygraph. The gun he had, which Peggy claimed was the murder weapon, was a .32 caliber, and the Sims were killed with a .38. It's speculated that Howells just told Peggy that to scare her and, quote, keep her in line, and Peggy hated her ex-husband so much at that point that she pushed the narrative to police in order to get revenge for the years of misery she went through with him. Next up, we have Tommy Fulgham, who was just 16 years old at the time of the Sims murder and didn't pop onto investigators' radar until 1979 when he was 29 years old and living in Atlanta. In Atlanta, Fulgham murdered Dale Purney on July 9, 1979. Around 10 p.m. that night, Fulgham was discovered just standing outside the apartment complex and clutching a quart jar containing one of Purney's internal organs. He was covered with blood, requested an ambulance, and said that something bad had happened. He told the ambulance attendant that pain proves one's love for God, referring to the finger he had severed from his left hand. He did not respond to Officer Thurman Williams' questions, but Officer Williams followed the blood trail to Purney's body. Blood was scattered all over the apartment and the sliding glass door was broken. Officer Williams found Purney in the bedroom. She lay disemboweled of all her organs from her genital area to her windpipe. A 12-inch butcher knife was stuck in the unclothed upper portion of her body. Some of Purney's internal organs were found in the bathtub. Other pieces were found on the floor in the kitchen and the living room. The autopsy showed that 44 separate stab wounds in the trunk and chest caused Purney's death. Dr. Lloyd Bacchus investigated Fulgham the day he was arrested. Dr. Bacchus diagnosed Fulgham as a chronic paranoid schizophrenic who suffered delusional compulsions triggered by religious stimuli. But this wasn't the first time he'd been diagnosed with this. Dr. David Moore had treated Fulgham during 3 separate hospitalizations. Dr. Moore diagnosed him as an incurable, long-standing, severe paranoid schizophrenic. He testified about previous psychiatric episodes, an attempt to gouge out his eyes, attempts to shave his head, declarations that he was the Antichrist, and an attempted suicide as a command from God. During one hospitalization, Fulgham was restrained the entire period to keep him from gouging out his eyes. Dr. Moore had last seen Fulgham 18 months prior to the murder. Now, his family testified that he had been normal until he became obsessed with religion in 1975. At trial, his defense tried to use the insanity defense, but that didn't fly. So what does this have to do with the murder of the Sims family 13 years earlier? Tommy Fulgham lived 2 blocks away from the Sims Muriel Court residence. Back when the murders first occurred, investigators were going door to door and talking to neighbors about where they were that night, if they had seen anything, etc. But every time they went to Fulgham's residence, Tommy wasn't home, to the point where investigators started to believe that he was avoiding them. Nothing more came of it then, not until 1979 when he did what he did to his girlfriend up in Atlanta. Investigators took another look at Tommy Fulgham. Even though he was so young at the time of the murders, they were not leaving any stone unturned. Well, it turns out that Tommy was at a party that night, and several people, including a former girlfriend of his, remember him there all night. Also, his fingerprints didn't match any found at the scene, so he was eliminated as a suspect. Now let's take our focus back to 12-year-old Joy Sims and the question about whether or not she may have been the prime target. Remember in the last episode when I mentioned a young man in the street and the other person who was a female driving the white car who later became a prime suspect? I also mentioned that there had been a peeping Tom in the neighborhood in the weeks before the murders. Mary Charles LaJoy, aka Charlie, was 19 years old at the time of the murder. Charlie, the daughter of a janitor at Florida State University, had a difficult upbringing. She was adopted and described her adoptive parents as being abusive, particularly her mother. It was said that she was fascinated with death. Charlie would visit the funeral homes in town and follow the employees around, asking questions and such. Eventually, it became more than just curiosity, it became an obsession. Rocky Beavis, who now runs Beavis Funeral Home in Tallahassee, said in the documentary 641 Muriel Court that his father had finally asked her not to come back because she was freaking them all out. Later, she'd been caught several times breaking into funeral homes and stealing items like funeral shrouds. At the time of the murders, Charlie was going to school at Madison Junior College. She could hardly keep a roommate at school because she was so strange and obsessed with death, no one wanted to be around her. Once she actually stuck a knife into a classmate's dorm room door and said, "Vernon is mine," when she thought her classmate was going after her man. Charlie apparently even followed Larry Campbell around as he was investigating the Sims murder. Needless to say, she didn't have many friends. She did have one friend, though, her longtime boyfriend, Vernon Fox Jr. Vernon Fox Jr. was 21 at the time of the murders. Charlie and Vernon had known each other since elementary school, and as they grew up, their friendship turned into something more. Vernon's upbringing appears to be just as dysfunctional as Charlie's. His father, Vernon Fox Sr., was a famed criminology professor at FSU. Dr. Fox, Vernon's father, was actually one of the head criminologists in the country. He founded the criminology department at FSU. Before that, Fox Sr. was deputy warden at the State Prison of Southern Michigan and the prison psychologist before he came to FSU. Now, Vernon Fox Jr. claimed that he visited with many inmate trustees who worked at their family home and at the nearby prison property. I played Chinese checkers every weekend with a nice old man who was serving 2 consecutive life sentences for murder. It was not your average childhood, Vernon Fox Jr. wrote in a Web Sleuth post in 2016. Father and son did not get along well. This is rumored to be because Dr. Fox had blatant affairs with other women and this angered his son. Vernon Jr. did a short stint in the Air Force but was discharged after 4 months for mental health reasons. He did go to school at the University of Florida in Gainesville for a little while before flunking out. At the time of the murder, he was attending school at the same junior college as Charlie. Vernon Fox Jr. lived on Von Sile Avenue, just behind Muriel Court. The Fox residence was actually catty-corner behind the Sims residence. This is an important fact to remember, as one of the running theories in the case was that the killer or killers approached the house from behind. Rear entry would explain why Muriel Court neighbors saw neither visitors nor unfamiliar vehicles the night the Sims were slain. The plants were trampled in the side yard, so there was evidence that the killer or killers sat and watched the house. Now, Charlie lived just 1 block down Von Sile Avenue on Hagen Drive. Remember back in episode 1 when I mentioned that there had been a peeping Tom problem in the neighborhood before the murders? Well, Vernon Fox Jr. is speculated to have been this peeping Tom. Now, I said speculated. I'm not saying that he was the peeping Tom. There had been many police reports filed for prowler activity and peeping Tom activity over the last few years before the murders. But it's kind of funny if you look at the times that Vernon Fox was in the Air Force or away at school, those reports seem to diminish. But when Vernon came back to town, they picked right back up again. Coincidence? Further, about a week before the murder, Vernon Fox was spotted by a neighbor on the Sims property back near some banana trees. As he sat there watching the Sims home with a clear view into the bedroom of 12-year-old Joy Sims, he was slicing the leaves on the banana trees with a pocket knife. Now, the leaves on the banana trees were definitely cut up, and that fact is not up for debate. So this is where I'm going to leave you this week, to ponder all of this information and every character I have introduced so far in this story. Please join me next week for part 3 of Massacre on Muriel Court. Massacre on Muriel Court is researched, written, and produced by me, Lauren Samples. If you'd like to support the show, please consider joining our Palmahawk Media Patreon page at patreon.com/Palmahawk Media. That's PALMAHAWK Media. On Patreon, you'll receive early and ad-free episodes of this show and our sister show, Paradise After Dark, along with exclusive content for both shows. Thanks for listening.